Hello and welcome to the Consistency Project with EC Sinkowski. My name is Patrick Cummings. In every episode, I have the distinct privilege of presenting EC with a question on subject matters that range from nutrition to fitness to the choices we can all make to live a healthier, more functional life. By exploring both the principles at play and the actions worth carrying out as a result, we aim to get you thinking, get you moving, and get you taking more consistent steps toward optimizing your well-being. Thank you so much, as always, for tuning in. How are you today, EC?
Very good. Ready.
Ready. Today, we're going to continue a conversation we started in our last episode. We had originally planned to have a conversation about the USDA guidelines, your thoughts on it, other people's thoughts on it. And in your preparation for that episode, you realized that there was actually a conversation we needed to have first. And so that conversation is our previous episode. It's one about fat, carbs, calories. So do make sure you go check that out if you haven't yet. And today we're going to get into that conversation about the USDA guidelines for nutrition. Before we do, though, we want to make sure people know about an experiment we're doing for Q&A episodes. We wanted to do Q&A episodes here on the podcast, or we hadn't quite figured out how we're going to do that, but we do know now, which is that we're going to record them live and we're going to pull questions in advance from people on your email list. So tell people about this.
Yeah, we wanted to kind of get more interaction with the Consistency Project community. So we're doing these Q&A episodes, but we also then thought, hey, we can get even more interaction if it's streamed live. So not only do you get your question on the list by being on my email list, but then my email list will get kind of the live streaming link about 15 minutes before it occurs. So they can log on, join us, ask follow-up questions, all that stuff. And the first one is going to be Wednesday, November 4th at 11 a.m. Eastern time. And yeah, so to get on the list, there will be a link in the show notes.
Excellent. It should be mentioned that your email list actually is full of goodies, full of things that are above and beyond even what you put on Instagram. And so if for that reason only, people should be on the email list.
Yeah. And I guess we should also say that, if you aren't able to make the live, I know not everybody can clear off their Wednesday mornings for the podcast, that we will post it as a regular episode. Yeah.
Cool. Love it. Okay. We're going to get into this part 2 of the conversation about the USDA guidelines. And it started with, or the kind of the trigger for our conversation and your diving into it was an Instagram post that you put up. When did you put it up? You put it up in April. And so I'm just going to read you the text on your graphic there, and then we'll let that kind of move us into the conversation. So you've got, if you think these 1980 USDA guidelines are too simple or outdated, you don't understand the problems. And so obviously we're going to dive into what these guidelines are. So no worries that you're listening to this and you can't see the guidelines. But where do you want to begin in this conversation?
Yeah. I think just set a little bit of background on that last podcast. I know you already mentioned it. People should go back and look at it. But, to talk about these USDA guidelines and how they've evolved over the years and the criticism of them, that they kind of maybe were the reason that they forced us into these high carb, low fat agenda in the 90s and made us all sick and all that stuff. And to really be able to judge the guidelines over time, we have to understand what makes good recommendations. And so that's really what that last episode covered. And to keep it really brief, hey, it turns out total calories matter. And then how your calories are split up in terms of macronutrients within those controlled number of calories matters a little bit less in terms of kind of maintaining weight. There's discussions to be had about those ratios for performance and health, but we have to look at this total caloric control. And then this low carb, low fat war sort of goes away. And so, yeah, that's really what we got into in the last podcast. But then kind of looking forward now, hey, what do we need to look for in these recommendations? It's, do we have caloric control? And then how do they split up the macronutrients and what are the recommendations within that?
So broadly speaking, as we dive into this conversation about the USDA guidelines for nutrition, can you give us a little bit of background, a little bit of history, a little bit of context as to what are these things? I mean, it's one of those things that you kind of see it and you're like, okay, yeah, I know what that is. Where do they come from? Maybe even when did they start? What was the overall goal for them?
Yeah, so they're published by the U.S. Departments of Agriculture and Health and Human Services. And the purpose is really to kind of look at the body of science, look at the literature of that time, and provide advice to Americans what will promote health and what will reduce their risk of chronic disease. The guidelines formally started in 1980. That was the year they released their first one, and they release them every 5 years. So in fact, we're expecting a version this year, but it will be at the very end of December, according to their website. Now, The way that these guidelines came to be is they're the result of a Senate Committee on Nutrition and Human Needs. And this committee actually started in 1968. And it was actually more focused on hunger initiatives, people that didn't have enough food. But by the mid 1970s, they realized they also had to address the other end of the spectrum, that we not only had people that were going hungry, but we also had people that were over consuming food as well. And so they released a document. It wasn't officially the dietary guidelines, but it was called the Dietary Goals of the United States. And this was in 1977. And the point was, and it's really a trip to read these goals. They're freely available on the USDA website, and I encourage people to look back at them. But the point was to point out eating patterns of this century that represent a critical public health concern. They write that Americans are confused to eat, and that we've got these staggering medical care costs, and they want to really promote health maintenance and prevention through nutrition, right? And so this is sort of just kind of like I said, it's a trip to read these guidelines because we consider ourselves so educated and sophisticated now. And a lot of what they were saying, they were 100% dead on, and this goes back all the way to 1977. Okay, so this report comes out. This is their first kind of initial stab. But then the official guidelines start in 1980. They're super basic. They're basically an 11-page pamphlet, for lack of a better word. And it makes sense. They're trying to tell people what to eat. Keep it simple. Start simple. I can understand that entirely. And then over the years, they've kind of gotten more and more substantial. The most recent one issued in 2015, it's 144 pages, got a ton of data about diet trends, food consumption, all these individual nutrient analysis, and so on.
It sounds like it, but I'm curious, were you surprised when you dived into this that it was maybe as spot on as it is? Or what did you believe maybe coming into this kind of research, and maybe where were you surprised by it?
Yeah, I think the narrative that we've been told in various forms is that the USDA got it all wrong, and they promoted this super high carb, low fat diet through the 90s, especially. And that is really the reason that we are all overweight and sick and have all these chronic diseases. And I actually started poking around with the USDA guidelines earlier because, of course, when people cite them, it's like, well, what are they actually saying? And I do remember looking at them in the current day, which was probably the 2010 version at the time, and sort of being like, well, this isn't that crazy. But I didn't necessarily do the deep dive all the way back to the 1977 document. So to sort of see how much they got right and how consistent they were, it definitely takes that narrative away for sure.
Interesting. Okay, let's maybe dive into some of that. You sent me, to paraphrase, you sent me kind of their 7 goals, right? In other words, this was your paraphrasing of their goals, right? And so I thought it'd be fun to just maybe walk down each one of those goals, kind of let you give whatever context, whatever sense you've got. But before we do that, anything context, anything worth mentioning before we get into that as it relates to, what they put out in the 70s or the evolution of kind of what they've said?
Yeah, I think just the thing to consistently remember is that we need people to have caloric control, and then we need to make sure that they're getting all the nutrients they need within those calories. So with that in mind, Patrick, what did they say?
Okay, so goal number 1, only consume the calories you need. And if you're overweight, decrease the calories you eat and increase exercise.
Yeah, first goal. Here we go. You need caloric control. And if you need to lose weight, you need to eat fewer calories. And then the next goals are going to get into doing that. But I think it's really important to point out that okay, their first goal is talking about we need to make sure that we're eating the right amount of energy for what our body needs.
Got it. Okay. Goal number 2, increase complex carbs and naturally occurring sugars.
Yeah. So this is the one where there's a couple, but people might freak out a little bit because it's saying increase complex carbs. I think we have to understand, and then of course they say naturally occurring sugars, that they're not talking about like chips and cookies here. They're talking about whole grains as like whole wheat bread. And this is, not necessarily totally industrialized whole wheat bread. They're talking about rice. And they also do specifically talk about fruits and veggies a bunch in there. They spell it out in this report as that's what they mean by this. So it's potentially misinterpreted what they mean there when they say increase complex carbs just at surface value.
Goal number 3, reduce consumption of refined or processed sugars from 45% to 10%.
Yeah, and that's of total calories. And guess what? That 10% goal is still our recommendation today, which is great. Keep added sugars below 10% of your calories. So I think it's important to kind of summarize the first 3 goals so far. It's like this is the group that supposedly made us all overeat carbs
Hmm.
and caused our obesity epidemic. But really, what we find in these first three goals is control your calories. And then, foremost within that, you're also going to have to make sure that you reduce your processed sugars. I'm just not so
Mhm.
sure this group is so clueless and like nefarious, you know?
Yeah. You mean it's not a government conspiracy to make
Not
us all
yet.
sick?
Not yet.
Not yet. Not yet. Okay. Goal number 4, reduce overall fat consumption.
Yeah. And again, if we've been told this narrative of they really were pushing high carb, low fat, this is where people are going to be like, well, they got this wrong too. Well, they didn't, because when you look at what they're telling you to do, they want you to keep fat at about 30% of calories. Now, that's the exact recommendation of fat that's prescribed on Dr. Barry Sears' Zone, which was so popular
Mm.
in the CrossFit community when we were supposedly learning, that carbs were all killing us and that really we need to have more fat. So again, I'm just not sure that the USDA is getting it wrong.
Goal number 5 is reduce saturated fat consumption to account for 10%.
Okay. So there is a trend throughout the guidelines where they definitely single out saturated fat. And we are going to have to kind of set that aside to dive into saturated fat on its own right in its own podcast. But, this is really saying, okay, 30% of your calories should come from fat. And within that, you're going to try to balance the fats. You're going to try to have 10% of your fats as polyunsaturated, 10% of your fats as monounsaturated, and 10% as saturated. Now, we can argue about whether or not saturated fat can go up and you can still be healthy, and the answer is yes. But this really isn't that crazy of a recommendation, and it's arguably still a good approach today. Because when you try to balance your fats in this manner, you end up seeking out different food sources, right? You end up having the avocado, you end up having the fish, you end up having some red meat, and so this isn't like that crazy to suggest an approach where you evenly balance your fats, which ends up being 10% of the calories come from saturated fat.
Next one is reduce cholesterol to 300 grams a day.
Yeah. So this is definitely an interesting one because we know dietary cholesterol doesn't have much effect on your blood cholesterol levels for many people, right? And so this would be one that's like, how effective is this goal? Now, dietary cholesterol does matter for some, so we can't say that this doesn't matter ever. I think something to point out here is they might not have gotten the science exactly right, which, by the way, we still don't have exactly right. But the application of a recommendation like this is that people end up reducing their calories. Now, why would that be? Because cholesterol and fat travel together. This is true how you find them in food, and this is true how you find them in the body. And so where you find high cholesterol foods are typically animal sources, which means they're going to be high in saturated fat. And it's not necessarily the saturated fat that we have to be so focused on, but that's still a good source or a heavy source of calories, right? Like it's still a way that you can have excessive calories in your diet. So by reducing cholesterol foods, they're also getting at this idea of we have to bring our overall fat calories down, which for, again, a lot of Americans is not the worst idea in the world.
The 7th goal, limit sodium intake by keeping salt under 5 grams a day.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good goal too. It's interesting because salt doesn't contain calories. So at first glance, this might seem a little bit odd, but again, once you interpret it in terms of how we eat food, not just in this individual nutrient analysis, processed foods are high in salt. And so when you have to cut out salt, guess what goes out the window? The chips, the crackers, the popcorn, right? And so you end up reducing carbs and fat as well. And so maybe salt isn't the problem for every single person individually, but when we look at food and what people are overeating, we end up getting the same good outcome. In summary, like you look at these 7 goals and they're really good. Maybe they got some of the rationale a little bit wrong, but we're talking 1977. We're talking about the first stab at government recommendations for the population as a whole. And reading this thing, this week, I was just like, wow, they should have just republished this document every 5 years. It's so good. It's so good. And the simple directives that, I post on Instagram about the 1980 official guidelines really just reflect these same ideas. And these tenets are still in their guidelines today. And so I just don't think that this group had no idea what they were talking about and they got it all wrong at all.
The one thing that probably I've heard more than anything else about the guidelines is the importance that they place on grains, right? When you think about, because it's still classically, it's still thought about probably as the pyramid, right? And the grains are on the bottom of that pyramid. So how should we think about that in relation to the fact that the 7 goals you just listed, by and large, make sense and are good.
Right. Yeah, the pyramid and the grains at the bottom of the pyramid. I think the guidelines do go a little bit sideways in the 90s, 1990, 1995, and
I
2000
think everything went a
guidelines.
little sideways in the 90s. Let's be honest.
But I think, they weren't that crazy. Okay, so the 1990 guidelines are the first year that they spell out 6 servings of grains or more. This is kind of the first time the guidelines really put a number on things as opposed to just
Mhm.
saying eat more, eat less. They start putting numbers on things and they say eat 6 servings or more of grains. And then in 95 and 2000, we actually have that pyramid image saying 6 to 11 servings of grains at the bottom. And at the top of the pyramid is this infamous, use fats sparingly, right? That's what you
Mhm.
remember. And that's what we have to kind of dissect a little bit. Okay, first of all, remember, they're still saying that this is how you're going to split up your nutrients within caloric control. In those guidelines, they still talk about maintaining a healthy weight. So, right there at the top, we have to make sure that we're understanding these serving sizes are only within the context of keeping your calories under control. Point number 1. So, not that bad. But
Yeah.
when we look at these grain servings, one of the things that's confusing about servings, and one of the things that I purposely got away from with the 800-gram challenge, it's just an ambiguous term. Like, what does servings mean? And it changes
Yeah.
whether or not you're having rice or bread or whatever it is. We're going to stick with bread. One slice of bread is a serving, and they're really consistent about talking about whole grains in these recommendations. And so they're talking about like whole wheat bread. They're not saying, you can have a serving of, a granola bar or chips, or they're not pushing for you to have that. They want you to have whole grains. And so we have to make the
Mhm.
distinction too between what they're recommending and what might be marketed as products. We see this today with even made with fruits and vegetables or made with whole grains. Like, that's not necessarily the USDA fault, right? But
Yep.
anyway, okay, we've got this serving of bread. I know, I digress. We got this serving of bread. That's one slice of bread. That's got 70 calories. Okay. So if we go to the high end of their recommendations, say 11 servings, 11 servings of bread ends up being about 770 calories when I look that up. Now, that might sound like a high amount of calories. Okay, wow, you're telling me to have almost 800 calories dedicated to bread. Well, we have to remember, put this in the context of the individual. And we said that we're picking the high end here. We picked the 6 to 11 servings, we picked the high end. Okay, so what's like the high end of calories in terms of this average population they're talking to? Well, it's going to be about 2,500 calories because that's kind of where men
Mhm.
fall, or more active people fall, larger people fall. Okay, so if we have, this 800 calories out of our 2,500 calories that is dedicated to bread, we still have 1,700 calories to go.
Mhm.
So I think right there is kind of the point of like, yeah, 6 to 11 servings sounds very high. And when we start breaking it down relative to caloric need, we still have room for other things in the diet.
Mhm.
And one of the things that they then say is this is fruits and vegetables. And when we look at the high end of that, it ends up being about an 800-gram challenge. Again, they use servings. It's hard to interpret, but whatever. Let's say they're about eating the volume of fruits and vegetables of, of an 800-gram challenge. That's about 500 calories, right?
Mhm.
So we've got these 800 calories from the bread. We've got 500 calories from the fruits and vegetables. That takes us up to about 1,300 calories. We've still got to get to 2,500 calories for this person, right? Does this like sound so completely crazy and excessive yet, right? Like, we haven't even filled up half their calories.
Right.
And I think that's something that people have to remember, is that like, people need to eat something, right? I love my fruits and veggies. I love the 800-gram challenge. But when we're looking at these high end ranges, when we're looking at really active people, they can't just rely on broccoli and apples. They need more calories than that. And filling up their diet with some rice and some whole grains is a very realistic and good solution to do that, right? So that's, I think, kind of the first thing is this focus on grains, sure. But when you start looking at it on a caloric basis, I'm not sure that it was really there. Now, I do think the protein is a little bit low, especially if we're talking about an athletic population. Arguably, that's not who they're talking to. And I do think that fat, is a little bit low relative. We could perhaps trade some of those grain calories for a little bit more fat calories. But notice I said trade, right? It's within this context of keeping that caloric control.
Trade versus add
Mhm.
is the distinction you're making there? Okay.
Exactly.
Yep.
And so, yeah, maybe we could have done a little less bread and add a little bit more avocado. Okay, but it's still within caloric control. Now, this pyramid went away after 2000. And it's in 2011 when it was officially replaced with the My Plate image. And I'm not sure if you've seen this as frequently, but
Hmm.
I think what's great about this is it's the first time we see a meal. It's kind of crazy to me that they start talking about nutrition in 1977, giving recommendations in 1980, and it's not until 2011 when we get a meal image.
Mm.
Half the plate is fruits and veggies, a quarter of the plate is protein, and a quarter of the plate is grains. And this really isn't that bad. And so yeah, the guidelines get a little bit grain heavy perhaps, but I really don't think it's that excessive as kind of the narrative has been made out to be.
Yeah, it's interesting because and we will probably continue to kind of deride marketing as at least part of the kind of the evil here. But really, what I'm hearing is, in the shift to the My Plate, that's just marketing. That's just saying, oh, actually, we need people to understand this. We need to meet
Totally.
them where they are, right? We need to present this information in a way that they can actually consume it. And is that idea, that mistake that perhaps they had made for years and years and years of it only being like, here's the data, here's the information, is that the mistake that they made? They didn't take that and then say, well, okay, that's good, but how are people actually going to understand and then implement these ideas? Was that kind of the primary mistake or challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I think that might be their primary mistake for sure. When I really think about what are the problems with the guidelines, I mean, there's a couple in there, but that's certainly one of the big ones. But I think maybe superseding that just slightly is no one's following them.
Hmm. And those are probably
Like
related, right?
they are related for sure, and
Yeah.
I think there's a reason why no one's following them. But regardless of what they wrote in them, no one's following them. And again, it's a
Mm,
trip to read this 1977 report and realize, wow, they just could repeat it every year. It's still fine. But yeah, no one's following them, and I don't think anyone's reading them. And why they might not be reading them, I think there's a couple different issues there. One though is what you're saying, like just readability and usability.
mhm,
If you look at the most recent report, the 2015 one, it's this 144-page document, and it's got a lot of great data in there, but it's just a little bit out of touch. Like, I don't know,
mhm.
is somebody going to like print this out and walk into the kitchen and really get started? And that's
Only
probably
you, EC,
I
only
know.
you.
And that's probably my biggest critique of the guidelines is they're not so wildly wrong. I just think they never put the information together in a way, and I still think it's a struggle for them that's really usable. Like they never really put the picture together of how macronutrients are related to calories like we did in our last podcast.
Yep, yep.
Instead they keep looking at it as like, let's talk about calories. Okay, now let's move on to food groups. Okay, now let's look at like micronutrients and all of these things. They treat them like they're in a silo.
Mhm,
And yeah, that makes sense from a data analysis standpoint, but not when you want people to go make changes. Again, we eat meals that are mixtures that are different foods, and those foods have different mixtures of nutrients. And so when the rubber meets the road, when the person walks into the kitchen Monday morning, like, what are they actually going to do? And that's why I love the My Plate image. It didn't happen till 2011, but picture speaks a thousand words, right? And that's what I
mhm.
try to do a lot with my Instagram. Not that that's so special or whatever, but it's just sort of like
I think
show
it's
people.
special.
Thank you. Show people what I'm talking about. Like, what does 800 grams look like? How can you do it? How do you make it accessible? Even, and just one more example on the guidelines, because again, I think there's some good data. It's just so obtuse. It's like, I go to their fruits and vegetables recommendation all the time not all the time, but frequently enough to make sure it like lines up with the 800-gram challenge and what are they
Yep.
saying. Gosh, I mean, they break down vegetables, I think, into 4 or 5 different categories. Fruits are a different category. Then, depending on which fruit or vegetable you're eating, the serving sizes change. And like every time I go look at this table recommendation, I still have to remember how it's set up and are they giving me calories per day or calories per week? And I'm just like, who is using this?
Mm,
Like, no one is using this. And so that was some of the impetus behind the 800-gram challenge is I need something that people can get started with without reading a manual, right? If we really want to
mhm,
make change, we got to make it easy.
mhm. Where do you think the disconnect is? Who do they think is gonna read this? Like, when somebody has to sit down and put this together, do you think that they just never think about Sally in her kitchen and they just don't care and they're just like, "We're just here to put the numbers down on paper and you should be able to do something with it?" Like, or do they just not think that that's the job of these guidelines, right? It's not the job of the guidelines to tell you what to eat tomorrow, it's to tell you what the science says.
Yeah.
And maybe the gap there is that nobody on a high level, nobody's job is it to tell you what to eat on Monday.
Yeah. I think it's important to remember this is a government organization.
Hmm.
Governments do not need to win customer market share. Their
Mm.
revenue is already being provided to them. So how well their documents are, quote, selling doesn't matter. Now, that's not true for corporate America, right? That's not
Yep.
true for the new diet. That's not true for me. I want people to be interested in what I have to say. I have to make them
Mm.
interested. And so this is where I don't want to get down politics and government funding, but it is very interesting that like they don't have a bottom line to hit. And being driven by a
Mm.
bottom line doesn't necessarily make all of our choices correct either, right? I mean, and that's
Right.
why I
Yeah.
don't want to drive this down that kind of route. But I do think it's interesting that they don't necessarily have to be in touch with their customer to still keep the whole thing going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a lack of maybe feedback loops there that make it better over time.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Right.
mean, if their customers don't like it, they're still going to be able to print and, produce the next document in 5 years.
Yep.
That's not true
Yep.
for anybody I know in business.
Right. Right. Okay. So if the guidelines themselves aren't that far off, and yes, we can talk about why the presentation end of things being leaving plenty of room for improvement. So who do we blame then? Who can we blame for the way that either they've been interpreted or for the fact that most people are doing, if not the opposite, pretty close to the opposite of what they're actually recommending? Is it, we've talked about it, we just mentioned it. Is it marketing's fault? Is
Mhm.
it media's fault? Like, where did things go wrong if the source material, at least when you look at it, isn't that wrong?
Yeah, I mean, I do think the media and the marketing is to blame. I don't like totally playing the 100% blame game. I think we have, some individual responsibility for tackling this as well. But the media and marketing definitely have an influence. It would be silly not to believe that. And I think the media in the 80s and the 90s is probably very similar to it is right now. The USDA, let's say, publishes their new guidelines. It's probably not a very interesting thing. Maybe it doesn't even get picked up by the news stations, but if it does,
Mm.
I mean, what are they going to say? Like, headline Americans still not eating healthy. I mean, let me tell you how many people are going to click on that article, right? Like zero. They got to sell ads. They got to
Mm.
sell, people driving to
Yeah.
their content. And so there has to be
Yep.
an angle. There has to be a story to tell. We know hit pieces and sensationalism sells, that drama sells. This is why Netflix documentaries about nutrition, they sell, not articles on PubMed. People aren't reading PubMed articles on a Friday night, but they're watching the documentaries.
You are, though, aren't you?
Sometimes. But, I think there's all this quote disagreement about nutrition, and it's really kind of this mainstream media war when I think the
Mm.
government recommendations and the science, there isn't that much of a disagreement. So the media, I think, definitely has a role. And I also think, of course, marketing has a role. And I think one of the
Mhm.
things that's so great about this 1977 report is I just loved it. They were talking about all the advertisements for processed food and that they
Mm.
don't have enough advertisements for fruits and veggies and that they should have public service announcements for fruits and veggies and that fruits and veggies just don't sell because there isn't enough of a product market to make them interesting for a business owner. I mean, it's just like, oh my
Mhm.
gosh, they're getting all this stuff, the same thing that we're dealing with now. And then this was really interesting. I found an article that's a present day article by Novak and Brownwell about the role of government on the obesity epidemic. And it's, I think, 2012, but they're giving stats from about 2010. And they said that Burger King spent 392 million, Coca-Cola 758 million, and McDonald's 1.3 billion in a single year for advertising. And the USDA in comparison spends about 200, so a percent or less than a percent, $2 million on advertising for My Plate when it came out.
Mm.
I mean, we've got McDonald's spending 1.3 billion and USDA spending 2 million. I mean, which voice is louder in the consumer marketplace,
Yeah, apples are not gonna win that fight.
Apples aren't winning.
Apple, the company might win that fight, but
Right.
apples themselves are outmatched.
But I joke around that I'm still waiting for my sponsorship from a Japanese yam farmer, It's just it's just not where the money is, right?
Yeah, yeah. Unfortunately not. Okay, so I started thinking about learning about nutrition really only when I started CrossFit, which so
Mhm,
2006, 2007. I think a lot of people have a similar story.
mhm,
And part of that story was that the USDA guidelines were off, were
mhm.
misguided, were something, weren't paying attention to perhaps.
Sure.
if my sense of that is right, where do you think that came from? Where do you think that comes from? That sort of mistrust of it, maybe for lack of a better way to put it.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly was a narrative within the greater CrossFit community, and I don't want to put all the blame on a certain person. I think we're going to get into the fact at a later point that's not the right way to go about it either. But I
Yeah.
do think within the CrossFit community there was a lot of influence by Gary Taubes in his book Good Calories and Bad Calories, which was published in 2007, and that
I
certainly
remember trying to read that.
Yeah, it's dense. It's got a lot of information in there.
I think I
A
still
lot
have
of
it,
stuff.
but
I mean,
yep.
we can talk about all of the merits and some problems, but this certainly has the narrative about the USDA and this idea of really promoting high carb, low fat diets, and we're all dying because of that idea. And
Mhm.
we got to cut back on carbs to be better off. Now, I think first of all, we got to take the step back, be end result driven here, and just be like, okay, this book has actually helped a ton of people, right? Eat less sugar, eat less carbs overall. Again, in our processed food environment, we do eat a lot of too many carbs relative, right? So this has had an overwhelmingly positive influence on getting people to be more smart about our modern food environment, right? So keep that
Mhm.
in mind. But I do think he gets some of the science wrong. I do think that calories matter. They aren't the whole story for sure. Not all of them are created equal, as we discussed in the last podcast. But it's not just that, it's now only carbs. And I think it's really important to point out that it's okay for people to get stuff wrong. Like, this isn't just like slandering, his
Mhm.
book. This is how we learn and how we put forth new ideas and how to make things better. So this isn't all just an armchair quarterback of him, but I do think he gets that wrong. And I think what's really ironic about what he gets wrong is that he's blaming the USDA for pushing this singularly focused agenda of high carb, low fat, and then replaces it with another singularly focused agenda of low carb, high fat.
Mm.
And I think
Mhm.
that's kind of what's the most ironic thing about it is it's playing this blame game on being too, what's it called, reductionist in our approach to nutritionists and replacing it with another reductionist approach, right? And so yeah, I mean, I think there's more to the story there, and we'll have to spend another podcast to go into the diet heart hypothesis versus the carbohydrate insulin hypothesis and all this stuff. There's some really good stuff there, but I do think it's probably a lot of the influence within the CrossFit community of why that belief came to be, and that maybe it's a little bit unbalanced, and maybe again we have to use that word and that it's not just carbs,
Mm.
it's not just fat. There's probably a factor or an influence of both.
It comes back to something that I feel like we've talked about before, which is like it's really hard to sell an idea when the idea is, well, it's complicated, right? When the
Totally.
idea is, no, there isn't a simple do this and not that.
Mhm.
It's more nuanced. And I think that that's the hill you've chosen to die on. And I think it's an admirable one, but it's a hard one because it's not, because, I said that just thinking about like, well, he replaced one prescription with another. It's like, well, yeah, of course he did, because he had to sell a book. He had to
Right.
say, all of this research leads us to do this new thing
Mhm.
and without that, it's like watching the end of a movie where it's like, well, the credits are rolling, but
Right.
the hero didn't get the girl yet, right? It's like,
Yeah.
well, it's more complicated than the hero getting the girl.
Well, how do you create your, back to marketing and stuff, how do you create your market niche? How do you have something
Yeah.
to say and people wanna hear
Yep.
it? Like, if you just sort of say, and it's actually funny, it's become my message, and it's only because it's contrarian that it actually has a niche, but it's like everything you knew was right.
Mm.
And, like, we don't need all this, quote, "new information," right? But that's
Yeah.
not how you really develop a niche unless it's the minority message, yeah.
As we wrap up this conversation, anything worth mentioning, worth talking about that I didn't ask you that you want to make sure you get in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really brings up and it re-highlighted it for me as well, the importance of checking primary sources. You can't just read the Instagram post, the newspaper article, the book, and then just think you have all the information and just rely on that. Go look at the primary source. Go back to where,
Mm.
they cite the data. And just because they cite scientific studies doesn't mean they got it right. Go back to it. I think you'll find you often have a different conclusion, just like going back to these 1977 guidelines. I think you're going to have a different conclusion about the USDA. And this isn't to say like everyone else is getting this wrong except for me. Like, I make mistakes too. Like, I want people to check the sources that I cite and go back and look at this
Mhm.
stuff on their own for sure. People are going to get it wrong. I think where we have to do better, and we all can do better, is that when you see these sensational pieces, or when you get the new insight into everything. Before you pass that on and before you become kind of the mouthpiece for it, check the primary sources. What does the data say? Does that make sense relative to the messaging?
Thank you, EC. Thank you to everybody out there listening. Thank you for your ratings and reviews. Do make sure that you head over and get on EC's email list so that you can submit questions for our future Q&A episodes, and we'll do multiples of them. So if you don't get it in for the next episode, we will do them again. And then we will see everybody on the next episode of the Consistency Project.